All right. As far as I can tell, there are at least as many people here now as before what wasn't a break. I'm Martin Sandbu. I'm the European economics commentator at the Financial Times, but more importantly, I'm your moderator for this Geopolitics panel. I'm told that we have a sharp finish at 6:45, so we'll just go straight into it. I will say who is on the panel, but not much more, because if I was going to kind of do justice to everything, plus everybody knows you anyway, we could be here all evening just introducing you. But I'll start with Arancha González, who's in the middle and is our host, sort of, today, I guess, at Sciences Po, Dean of the International Affairs School here at Sciences Po, and a former foreign minister for Spain, and many, many other high positions in international politics and policy. Next to Arancha is Yuriy Gorodnichenko, who's professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and from whom most of us have learned everything we know about the Ukrainian economy, I think. We all had crash courses a couple of years ago. And next to me, Jean Pisani-Ferry, well known to you all. You've sort of seen European and French economic policy up closer and longer for anybody else here. And I think you're a fellow at too many think tanks to count, and a professor at too many universities to count, so I'm not going to. But it's great to have you all. Since this is the last panel of the day, I've told my friends on the panel that we're not going to do 5 to 7 minute introductions, which for real academics often turn into 15-minute introductions, but just kind of get right into it, asking them each a question to just get started with some short, snappy answers, then really try to get a conversation, because you probably agree on a lot of things, disagree on some things, and it'd be good to get into the hard details of how to think about geopolitics, and perhaps especially how economists, we're mostly economists here, need to think about geopolitics in this new era. So I'm going to kind of ask a question in reverse order from, well, by longest distance to me, as it were. And just start with you, Yuriy, because the thing we all wonder, the thing we're all thinking about, the very concrete thing we're all thinking about, is the 24-hour peace promise that Donald Trump has made. So apparently we will get peace in Ukraine somehow soon. I would like to hear your overall thoughts about what he might do and how the rest of us need to prepare for that.
It is a very difficult, very important question. Indeed, he said he is going to have peace in Ukraine in 24 hours. I think it is not going to happen in 24 hours or in 24 days or maybe even in 24 months. It will take a very long time. And let me give you my reasons why I don't think it's going to happen. One, for this to happen, you have to have some type of agreement from Ukraine and from Russia. So far, Russia has demonstrated zero interest in any kind of negotiations, right? They keep saying that Ukraine has to capitulate, Ukraine has to disarm, Ukraine has to do this and that. They do not engage in any kind of activity that can be described as, peace-seeking. Also, the objective of the special military operations were not to have some type of, negotiated deal. This was really, an objective was to destroy Ukraine. It's as simple as that. Now, this is the Russian side. Now, why Ukraine is not going to be accepting these terms? Obviously, it is an existential war. Nobody in Ukraine wants to be enslaved by Russia again, and it's very hard to find intersection of these two, negotiating positions. Probably more importantly, if you put yourself in the shoes of President Zelensky, you wonder who is going to enforce this deal. Who is going to put, some type of enforcement mechanism that is going to guarantee durable peace in Ukraine? Is it going to be NATO? Doesn't seem like it. Is it going to be French troops that will separate the Russian troops and Ukrainian troops? I don't think so. They declare they're not interested in this kind of deal. Now, Ukraine has signed many deals in the past with Russia, and none of them held for a long time. Think about just, the recent history. When Russia annexed Crimea, they said this is the final point. We're going to stop here, no more attacks on Ukraine. Then, shortly after, they occupied the Donbas. Okay, they said again, this is the last time we're going to take any Ukrainian territory. But, a few years later, they attack Ukraine again. Now, if you're President Zelensky, obviously you're not going to believe any promises coming from the Kremlin unless they are supported by some serious security guarantees. And I don't see any clear security guarantee that is going to support this kind of ceasefire. Now, when you look at other players who are involved in this, think about not just Ukraine, but a broader geopolitical picture. If Ukraine kind of surrenders, then all other countries in the region should be alarmed because they may share a border with Russia. And, Poland is spending 5% of GDP on rearming itself. Finland used to be a neutral country, which was, very well armed. It's probably going to be even more well armed. And you think about broader economic implication. If there is a security concern that your country is not particularly safe, we can have, all sorts of bad situations coming to happen in this country. Think about the Korean discount, where wonderful Korean companies are traded at lower prices just because there is this residual concern that things can go south. Kim Chen-in or somebody else crazy can attack the country and destroy these wonderful businesses. Now, even a basis point increase in the cost of capital for these countries is going to be very expensive, because these markets are so big. So Trump does not control these different players. That's why I think it's going to be very hard for him to enforce any kind of deal on other countries, European Union specifically. He has zero leverage on Russia. What can he do to Russia, right? Think about North Korea. It has every possible sanction. They continue to do crazy stuff. We have a bunch of sanctions on Russia. Is this going to change behavior? No. So how can you force Putin to have a deal? I think the Trump team, the transition team, comes to slow realization that, giving up Ukraine and signing some type of deal is not going to be good for anybody. Just think about this. You look at the polls of American public, and only 7% of Americans have a positive view of Russia. More than 2/3 have a positive view of Ukraine. How you can kind of have a deal that is going to give up Ukraine in this kind of landscape? It's going against, all sorts of political constraints in the U.S. So they come to realization that that's not going to be a good deal. You have to have peace at some point. But the only peace you can achieve is peace through strength. It means giving more weapons to Ukraine, tightening sanctions on Russia, kind of applying more pressure, spend more on defense, increase the Pentagon budget, and keep doing this until Russia is brought to the negotiating table. That's the only solution I see. But this means it's going to take a lot of time. It's not going to be soon, maybe a year, maybe or two, before the price of the war will be so high for Russia that they will decide to have some type of conversation.
That's really interesting, because it's partly kind of goes against what's been the conventional wisdom. So you're basically saying, if I can paraphrase you, Trump doesn't really have leverage over any of these players. He can't enforce anything. And
Nope.
And I take it, in particular, he's not going to be able to make Ukraine stop fighting. Right?
If my calculations are correct, Ukraine has financial resources and military resources to fight for at least another 6 months. Think about this.
Even without any more,
Zero
because the
help.
one thing he can do is to
Yeah.
pull the U.S.
Yeah.
funding, which he probably will
Look,
do.
when the Congress did not approve funding for Ukraine continued to fight for about 6 months, and then things got, really complicated. I assume it's going to be the same time window. For at least 6 months, there is enough resources to continue it.
Arancha, given what Yuri's just said, I mean, there seems to be a lot of movement among European politicians at the moment based on the conventional case, which is the US is going to pull its support and we're all doomed unless we do something. I mean, is that the correct description of what's actually going on? You are much closer to these people. And to what extent do you assess that something is actually changing in the way Europe, the EU in particular, EU countries, but Europe more broadly, is trying to, shall we say, take responsibility for what happens in its own neighborhood? How well are we doing?
So let me say that I very much agree with Yuriy that we may be at the time when we are overestimating the US, including the US economic strength. We are underestimating the European Union, including the ability of the European Union to surprise by doing what the EU is meant to do, but finally do it, which is the brand that the EU knows to do. And we may be ignoring many others that are out there and that are occupying different spaces. And what's happened in Syria in the last days tells us that we may not be we are not looking closely enough to other actors, including one that is very close to us called Turkey, that has been organizing its game very studiously, not in the last days, but in the last months. So let's just make sure that we are not surprised by all these movements and that we are not looking in the wrong direction, or we are not only looking at one direction, which is what we tend to do. So what's the European game? As I said, the Europeans are the underdog in politics. They are always underestimated, and they always underestimate themselves. So the only way to play your hand, if you are the European Union, is to surprise by delivering. So where is it that the European Union is delivering? From the best to the worst. In my view, the EU, in order to be a geopolitical actor, has to deliver in 3 different dimensions. Let me start, since we are talking to economists, let me start with the economy. It has to strengthen its economic hand, and this means doing a bunch of things that the EU knows it has to do, but it hasn't done in the last years, which is defragmenting its market, integrating in energy, integrating in technology, and integrating in capital markets. And we have a bit of a test case of whether or not the EU is serious about doing capital markets, with a number of movements in the banking sector that are awaiting a decision. And frankly, if a number of these banking decisions don't go through, the idea that we're going to be doing integration of capital markets would be a little bit difficult to believe. But hey, it's there.
UniCredit and Commerzbank.
I'm talking about UniCredit. But the case is out there. So this, let's see. Defense and security, this is an area where the EU slowly but surely is getting its act together. It's putting its house in order. It's organizing what the EU would do in the EU, what the EU would do as part of the EU pillar in NATO. And it's looking already discreetly, but you have bit bubbles of that on how it's going to finance the expenditure on defense. And the third part, where, in my view, the EU is doing a little bit better, is building alliances with others, which is what will help the EU buffer the wins that the EU is going to suffer. So there are 3 good, in my view, movements that are happening. We saw the EU-Mercosur deal, a deal that, having been part of the negotiations back in the year 2003, 4, 5, I'm glad to see come finally to an end. But there is 2 others in the vicinity that we may not be paying enough attention to. EU-Switzerland, that slowly but surely is making its own way. And the reset between the EU and the UK, that in its own very clunky way, and it's clunky because it can only be clunky, it's also starting to reconnect something that was very artificially disconnected. So, jury is out, but let's look at the signals that are being sent for European Union that is starting to do a bit for now of what it's meant to do to play its hand on the geopolitical field.
So just before going to Jean, can I just ask you concretely then, do you think it's maybe not likely, but sort of plausible that we get, 2 things are being talked about at the moment, possible European country forces in Ukraine in some sort of peacekeeping or security guarantee capacity. We've seen these conversations between President Macron and Donald Tusk recently. Is this something that it's at all realistic? And secondly, common borrowing for some sort of defense fund, whether it's air defense shields or something else. That's the other thing that's kind of out there. Are these more than pie in the sky, is what I'm asking?
No, I think there is serious conversations going on both. On the first one, and it's a very sensitive conversation, and this is why you see this appear and you see this disappear. because this is a big issue, but what the EU is saying, what Europe is saying is no solution on Ukraine without Ukraine, and no solution, or no design of the European security future without Europe. Now, the corollary of this is that Europe has to be ready to invest. If it wants to have a say and be at the table and have a say about its own future security architecture, it has to be ready to put the money where the mouth is. Now, how much of this will percolate and where would percolate and how it would percolate, it's an open question. And on defense, it's no secret, I mean, there have been a number of conversations on a new next-gen EU on defense. The discussions were led by France with Baltics, not with Southern Europeans like last time, with different actors. There is a bit of a conversation ongoing at the moment about that. To do what? How much? To invest where? Like there is a conversation to use the firing power of the European Investment Bank a little bit more into security and defense, not necessarily mostly for this area of double use, which is still, given what we are seeing in the war in Ukraine, an area to be fully exploited. So all of this is happening. How much of this will emerge and when will it emerge? It's an open question.
Jean, I really want to hear what your own thoughts and comments about what we've heard from Yuriy Arancha, but just to broaden it out, the sort of developments that Arancha in particular is envisaging would be kind of a big change in how Europe sees its place in the world. And the kind of old trope is that the EU has kind of dealt with the world as a small open economy and a big multilateral rules-based system. So I guess the question is on the one hand, is the EU ready to see itself as something else than that, but also is what remains of the global system kind of ready for a more assertive EU, if that is what's going to happen?
The conversation in the EU has changed. That's without doubt, because of the reality, and because of the threat of Trump withdrawing from supporting the EU and Europe in general, and Ukraine in particular. From that, does it lead with high probability to a change in actual decisions? That's where there is room for discussion. Because I'm less confident than my fellow panelists that things will happen. I completely share the view that they should happen, but I'm not sure they will happen because of traditional divisions within the EU, because of fiscal concerns, because of US influence. All that can lead to the project of a European defense identity. It can lead this project being sidetracked. So that's my take. Now, I think it needs to be checked against a benchmark. I mean, a serious benchmark. What will be the first moves, and how will they be indicating that the EU is really serious about its defense ambitions?
When you mention US influence, what do you have in mind? I mean, you're suggesting that the US can would like to, and would act to prevent the sort of cohesion
No, what I'm
of the EU as a geopolitical
what I'm
actor.
saying is that many countries in Europe have as a sort of first type of reactions, reflex to events that they use to the U.S. umbrella, and so to distantiate themselves from the U.S. to become more autonomous is not something that can be taken for granted for many countries, and understandably so, because the U.S. is providing the kind of security that the European countries are used to. France is an exception in this regard. I mean, many other countries regard the strategic autonomy, or whichever concept you can put forward, as a distance taken from the U.S., and they're afraid of U.S. reactions.
Where do you see the UK fit into this as the other, apart from France, the other European power with some autonomous military thinking, basically?
I haven't heard much from the new government, the Labour government, but I think the UK is, in fact, yes, a serious player. And whether the UK also enters into some of a partnership with the EU on defense and security will be crucial.
What you've just said about how some European countries think about the US umbrella, Jean, makes me think of a question I'd like to ask you, but all of you. It seems to me that some of the what's happened in the last couple of years is for many European countries, traditional preferences that used to be aligned, in different dimensions, not between different countries, are coming into opposition with one another. So if you think about Eastern Europe and the Baltics, those are the questions that probably most vocally think about the NATO and US relationship as the foundation of their security. And yet they're the ones that are the most concerned about what the threat to them, depending on what happens in Ukraine. So there's sort of more of a tension there now that the US pulls out, and maybe more of a tension between preferences that used to be aligned than is the case for a country like France, as you brought up, or other West European countries. Another tension that to me seems to be emerging is that it's becoming very hard to be both a fiscal hawk and a defense hawk, because defense is requiring a lot more money. And so you're seeing these funny things where the Prime Minister of Denmark, for example, is now publicly musing about the need for common borrowing for defense purposes. So again, there's some sort of de-alignment of traditional views and preferences. So I'd just like to hear, what you think about that framework and how you expect that to be resolved.
I think that the right framework
for all of you.
Yeah. My short answer is that it's the right framework to think about those issues. It doesn't lead to the conclusion that it's going to be easier than assumed by my fellow panelists. So I think we have to be realistic about the obstacles and how to overcome the obstacles.
Yuriy, Arancha, you
about
agree?
fiscal stuff, as somebody who studied fiscal multipliers for many years, I can tell you that defense spending and fiscal, balances are not necessarily mutually exclusive. If the multipliers are big enough, you spend $1 or €1 on defense. In fact, it can almost pay for itself. I'm kind of oversimplifying this, but the fiscal cost in the end of the day may be not as high as many people think. That's the first observation I want to make. The second observation I want to make is that Russia spends $120 billion, current dollars, on its war machine, right? So if you use PPP to convert this into kind of real military might that is generated by this funding, you have to multiply this by at least 3, okay? Now, very clearly, no single country in the European Union is going to be a match in terms of this spending capacity. It has to be a collective effort. And so if we want to match that capacity, it has to be, like 500 billion euros, maybe 600 billion euros. It has to be a collective borrowing exercise. And ultimately, when we think about defense, it's one of the things we teach in economics, right? If you think about the public good, what is the number one public good that we give as an example? It's defense, right? You can't exclude people from defense. Everybody has to contribute. And to the extent European Union wants to have a union and collective defense, it has to have a collective effort to pay for it. You look at the U.S. defense sector, it is huge and effective, very innovative, in part because it economizes on scale, right? It's so big that you can have, so many producers producing so many different things. You look at Europe, it's very fragmented. You have a German champion in defense industry, you have a French champion in defense industry. They're not really talking to each other. We're not economizing economies, or we're not utilizing the economies of scale. So there are many, many things you can do here. But one thing which is striking for me is that the Russian invasion did not start yesterday, or last week or last month. But we still have conversations about how much exactly we're going to spend and who is going to do this. This is, I think, one sad part here, because the Russians, they are not thinking that they are fighting in Ukraine with Ukraine. They're thinking they are fighting with NATO. Right? So we should be very clear. They don't think Ukraine is the resistance force here. It's the NATO they are fighting with. And if you look at countries like Estonia and so on, they are terrified. I can tell you this story. I have a visiting professor from Estonia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, he went to a gun shop to buy a gun. And he is a guy who is a pacifist. He never wanted to have a gun. And he was very heartened that the line to buy the guns was so long that he couldn't buy a gun. They ran out of guns. He said, okay, we're safe probably for now. But we shouldn't count on this. Estonia is a small country. We can't, sacrifice Estonia to prove the point.
You're basically saying this is not as challenging as the general debate would have it, right? It shouldn't actually be that difficult.
No. Think about this. An extra percentage, in government spending as a percent of GDP, it's not that expensive. And it's an investment. We think about this as a cost. I think it's the wrong way to think about this. Defense is an investment. You guarantee security. One basic fact out there is that the cost of borrowing, the cost of capital, is decreasing in the size of your military force. Why? Because it guarantees security, that somebody will not attack and take away your business. It's kind of very simple calculus here, but nobody's doing it here to say it's not a cost, it's an investment.
I mean, you say 1%, it's not that big, but down the street here, people are trying, maybe very hard, I hope very hard, to save about 1% of this deficit. We'll get back to France, obviously.
Quick point on the multipliers. True, but provided you're buying European equipment. If you're buying US equipment, the multiplier is trivial.
Well, it's a question how soon we want to have weapons. If we want to have it today, we have to buy it in the market. That's the fastest way to do it. If we want to build capacity to defend ourselves, then obviously we have to invest in the productive capacity so that we can deliver this stuff domestically. Think about defense spending in the U.S. They have a legal requirement there that 90 or 95% of spending has to be domestic. Right. This is why this multiplier is big, because you have so little leakage. And obviously, if you have a European producer who sources like 50% of stuff from other countries, it's not going to be a big multiplier, because it will go to the US or Korea or some other country. It's an uncomfortable position, but we're in this position precisely because we did not make this investment in the past.
Yeah. But Yuriy, just to be clear, this is a Keynesian argument, right? So there's a short-term demand growth effect and so on, but you're not suggesting anything else than that in the long run, this is spending that, it is a cost, and that
No,
it's
there-
obviously much better than the alternative of being invaded.
there is a
but if it
cost.
works,
Look, I
it
don't-
sits there and never gets used.
Martin, I don't want to sound like I'm Ronald Reagan or somebody like that. But, what I want to say is that many good things sort of came out from defense spending. Think about nuclear power. It was a Manhattan project, right? Think about microwave. It came from radar. It was a military project. And you have many, many things which came out from technological advances funded by the government for defense purposes. The payoff from this is not going to happen immediately. I don't think anybody quantified, the net cost of the Manhattan project. It was immensely expensive. There is no question about this. But did it bring benefits that we use today? Absolutely, yes. And I make a guess that if we calculate the present value of the things we gain from developing nuclear power, we're probably on the net in the black.
That is a really alluring argument about the technological effects of military spending, which sounds true and also impossible to know in advance. But we've all learned, thanks to Mario Draghi, we all know now that the EU spends far too little in high-tech stuff. So maybe this is a way to kill two birds with one stone. Arancha.
Now, first, let's not kid ourselves. Defense and security spending is a tough issue in Europe because it's not just an economic issue, it's a social and cultural issue. In Europe, the culture to war is very different depending on which part of the European Union you live. Happen to come from a country where the idea of investing in defense is still very much clouded by our past, by who we have been. And yet, if I look at my own country, we've increased our defense spending by 4 billion, and we've just announced 7,000 new recruits into the army, something that hadn't happened in the last decades. So something is changing because we realize that we are under threat. Now, the defense conversation cannot just be a purely economic or fiscal conversation. It has to be also integrating this social and cultural dimension, because that is the hardest to deal with in Europe. And I don't think we help this discussion by saying, let's cut on education and on pensions and on healthcare to invest in defense. This will not get us there. I think we have to be a bit careful with that argument. Now, to the fiscal. The fiscal debate has also changed in Europe. And the topography of the debate has changed in Europe. And the center of gravity of the change is called Germany. In 2008, it was all about moral hazard. So it was no. In 2020, it was a systemic threat to the internal market. And it worked. And today, it's a problem for Germany, because Germany is not investing enough. And it has put itself brakes to its own investment that today do not fit any longer with the necessity to boost the economy. So that fiscal debate is also changing in the European Union, which is not to say that everyone will gladly move into a next generation EU for defense, but this topography of the debate on the necessity to have fiscal rules that are a little bit more attuned with the reality of the investments that the EU needs to make, including in defense and security, has changed. I look at the debate today and I look at the debate as it was in 2020 when we were trying to construct Next Gen EU, and it has fundamentally changed. In 2020, you would have to, if you were sitting in my seat or in the Portuguese seat or in the Italian seat, you would have to convince the Dutch Prime Minister, Rutte at the time, that, sharing the investments, including through a common investment with common debt. And the number of episodes we had to go through until he said yes. But if you look at the Netherlands today, if you look at the manner in which this debate has evolved in some of the countries that at that time were on that part of the fence, including Denmark, it has changed.
Yep.
So the fiscal debate has also evolved, which is again not to say that it will be easy to do, but I think we also have to be lucid about the things that have happened since the war in Ukraine started, because I do think that there is a big evolution in the debate and in the mindset in Europe, which again, now we need to translate into action, and it's not going to be easy, but it's there.
In a second, I want to open up to questions because I'm sure there are some. I want to bring Jean in first, but I don't want to wait with the questions and squeeze them at the end. So get your questions ready. Jean, did you want to come in on this?
No, I think we agree. I mean, we agree on the principles. We agree on what ought to be done. We have different assessments of the likelihood of this policy being implemented. But that's a normal uncertainty in a conversation. I'm a bit more skeptical. I think there are more obstacles than recognized by my fellow panelists, but I wish I'm wrong.
And what's the nature of those obstacles?
The obstacles having to do with the fiscal obstacles, the obstacles having to do with the fragmentation of the defense market, all those obstacles that are well known and that have prevented us from moving forward for a very long time.
Yeah. There were a couple of questions, so we'll do a little round there. Is there one more? No, let's take those two, and please state your name.
I come from a country, Brazil, that never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Right?
You're not alone.
Now it seems that Europe is beating us in this game right now, because okay, if you don't want to embark into a European defense big scheme for understandable reasons, there are plenty of other fields, domains, where you could have a completely new, suggested by Mario Draghi, joint financing of a European recovery plan through investment. It's plenty of evidence on the climate front. You can have also the revamping of a European social welfare state. So this is demanded in both countries that are currently in dear trouble. Germany is in recession, France is sort of decelerating. So you have the two major economies that are in Europe demanding some macro action. You have also obviously, I think we all realize that you have a far right in Europe that is at the gates of power. So what if through some revamping of social and public goods expenditures, you would sort of at least address some of the claims that are made by these electors? And on top of that, you have, let's say, a situation where we heard yesterday on the monetary policy front, well, let's do it gradually, prudently, business as usual, converge slowly towards the neutral. Why if on top of, let's say, some fiscal action, which can be done in all these fields, not defense, but on these fields of climate, social, and technology, what if you could sort of also support this by a bit more monetary policy aggressive action to sort of make sure that you have a bit more recovery and engine of growth with technological change and social upliftment.
Thank you.
So opportunities are plentiful. Why not?
Why not? Please.
I'm Summer Walter. I'm located in Istanbul, Turkey. Now, my question is, does the Ukrainian conflict have spillover effects? And are those spillover effects relevant for a solution that goes beyond the U.S. and the EU?
Anybody else before we go back to the panel? Yes, please.
Yes, Christian Helbig from Toulouse. The one elephant in the room that in the entire discussion about obstacles was not really mentioned is the domestic
Thanks very much. I'm going to. I see a sort of domestic dimension and an international dimension to these questions. So I'm going to package them a little bit. Why is it not happening? So a lot of the things we talked about already made sense 5 years ago, 10 years ago, especially the economic ones, ending the fragmentation in the defense markets and so on. We've been talking about these things for a long time. So why haven't they happened? What is the political economy blockage? Let me add to that, because we have to talk about the absence of effective governments in both Germany and France. So I'll just add to that question by asking, to what extent are these problems actually political, and with different political constellations would we get different actions? Or is it better to think of them in terms of deeper incentive structures so that pretty much no matter who gets elected, we'll still have the same challenges? So to what extent do the actual people in power, I suppose, and their parliamentary support matters? And then we'll get to the spillover effect in a bit. But let's start with that. Who would like to? Yuriy.
I'll start with the question about spillovers. We should obviously ask our Korean friends and Taiwanese friends about spillovers if they feel comfortable with what is happening in Ukraine and if they feel safe. You see that the Russian troops were active in Africa, overthrowing legitimate governments many times. So all this trouble shows up not just in Ukraine, but in many other parts of the world. More importantly, if somehow we allow another country to invade a big country, especially a nuclear power country, to invade and annex another country, it basically says that everybody should have nuclear weapons because that's the only way for you to guarantee that numerical superiority is not important. And so all sorts of countries are going to try to develop nuclear weapons. It's not going to be a safer place. In the US, they often say it's okay to have guns because, for every bad guy with a gun, you have a good guy with a gun. It's kind of an equilibrium in the US. That's a terrible equilibrium. We don't want to have the same situation, but with nuclear weapons. Now, in terms of, the conversation we have about, why it's not happening. And I think, again, we frame everything as a cost, not as an investment. Think about the cost of not supporting Ukraine, not investing in Ukraine. So you look at military spending, okay? President Trump effectively is saying Europe has to radically increase spending on defense, maybe extra 1% of GDP in France, maybe even more for other countries. I think Spain is below 2%, so long ways to go, maybe even double. 16,000 recruits, I'm not sure that's going to cut a lot with President Trump. I don't know, we'll see. But what I want to say is that, you look at this, France will have to increase spending by roughly 50%. Okay, so this is 30 billion euros per year. Now, when you calculate this over a longer horizon, because this is going to be happening for many, many years, you calculate the present value of that, and we're looking at something like 250 billion euros. That's the present value of this extra defense spending. Now, there was some discussion about, the cost of capital and how safe things are, and I already mentioned the Korean discount. Now, look at how much private debt and public debt we have in France. You look at this, it's roughly probably a 300% of GDP, something like this. It tells us that if the cost of capital is increasing by 1 basis point, just 1 basis point, a really tiny number, it's going to mean that the French economy is going to spend an extra billion euros on the cost of capital every year. Now, if it's 1 basis point, it's 10 basis points, or 50 basis points, or 100 basis points. It's going to be extremely expensive, and it's not just France. You look at all other countries in the European Union. Now, think about all the negative spillovers that can come from Ukraine. For people who are older enough, they remember that when Yugoslavia fell apart, it was lots and lots of problems in other countries, crime, refugees, many, many things. Ukraine is a much bigger country. Already since the beginning of the war, European Union spent $125 billion, euros, on refugees. Now imagine this number is going to double because things go south in Ukraine. Okay, it's going to be a lot of money. Now, when you look at this present values and you say how much does it compare with, say, an extra year or 2 years of support to make sure that Russian aggression is defeated in Ukraine. And then you're looking at multipliers like 1 to 10, basically giving Ukraine a euro in extra aid is going to save you 10 euros down the road. Now, these calculations are obviously done by Ukrainians, so you should double check it. But, it gives you an order of magnitude. We are not making these calculations, and we are not thinking about this as an investment. Say, it's going to cost us this much. But think about the alternatives. That's what is economics about. How much extra money we're going to spend down the road. Our trade-off here is that we spend more now, or going to spend a lot more in the future.
I was going to say, it's not just that it's said by a Ukrainian, but by an economist. So the answer to the question is basically governments aren't doing the cost-benefit analyses properly. But where is the politics then? I get back to that dimension. Jean, Arancha?
No, I mean, look, every democracy has trouble with politics today. Let's start from this assumption. It's not only that France and Germany are the exception. Look around. Democracies are under stress. And one circumstance is right now anti-incumbency, the fact that people are reacting against what they saw, an increase in the cost of living worldwide in every democracy. Others are more permanent. Fragmentation of the political landscape. The idea that you have a big majority to govern with is not a reality today. It's a fragmented political landscape. And you have to build consensus, and you have to build political alliances. And sometimes these political alliances are very painful to drive, which obviously sucks a lot of oxygen that doesn't go into making big reforms, neither at home nor in the European Union. This is a reality. So what trigger changes this? Is when when governments feel that they are facing a threat. And that's when these coalitions, kind of close ranks or totally implode. This is what we have seen. I've been having to do a lot of, balancing when I was in government because you have to you need the votes to get things through your parliament. It's not easy to get the votes through. So let's assume that we are not an exception, we are a rule. France and Germany are two different cases. I worry more about France than I worry about Germany, because in Germany, this idea that you've got to put together a coalition is a well-known path. It's less so in the case of France, where they are having to find this path the hard way. And they are not there, but in every time, every new twist and turn is taking the country into that direction. So, sorry, it's tough. What can I say? Second, on what spillovers from Ukraine, there are lots of spillovers from Ukraine. It's very interesting what's happening to the east. When you look at North Korea, it's not North Korea, it's the relationship between Russia and China. Is North Korea telling China, I've got choices, which is not a very comfortable situation to be in for China. It has a ramification on South Korea that has used this moment to pretend there is a threat coming from North Korea to operationalize a coup. There is a big display of the spillovers in the Middle East with Turkey, with Israel, and with Iran, ups and downs. There is big ramifications of this in Africa, where Russian interference is giving way to something different that is not Russia interference, which will be much more complicated for us to manage, in my view. There is, obviously, alliances that in the past, Luis, we would maybe not have seen happening. EU-Mercosur. And there is the enlargement of the EU. All of this is spillovers in different ways, with different speeds, with different results of the conflict in Ukraine, and there is much more, but I guess there may be other questions.
Just before we go to Jean, you think that EU-Mercosur will be ratified, yes? It will be passed in the Council on QMV?
Yeah,
against French objections?
I was in this room a week ago, I think, a few days ago, and my bet is that it will go through. Yeah.
Okay.
But, I'm taking a bet.
Jean?
How much?
Actually, I agree, and I think it is desirable because it's really. Sorry.
Is everything okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Should we go on?
Yeah, I forgot the seat has no back.
Be careful.
Yeah, so I think on Mercosur, it is desirable that the agreement be ratified for a simple reason, which is that the test case of the ability of the EU to form alliances with other blocs and other continents. If the EU does not ratify, the signal will be, we're stuck in the type of environment in which we operate. So I think it's highly important that it's ratified, and if it requires that France be put in a minority, so be it. And it probably requires that France be put in a minority. Now, on the broader issue, because you have broadened the scope of the discussion, I think we have also to think about what the significance of the change in the US attitude and what are the consequences. My take on the Trump stance is that essentially it's a manifestation of the fact that the US is tired of playing the role it used to play. It has been playing in the global system, and so this, I think, is gone for good. We're not going to have the US playing again this kind of rule. The US does not consider anymore that the implicit contract, exorbitant privilege and exorbitant duties, it's worth being ratified, and so that has considerable consequences for the way the world is organized and for the way the EU behaves. I think the EU is not going to replace the US in this role, and actually China is not going to replace the US either. So there is, we're in a world, in a new world in which there is no center. There is no. It's a truly multipolar world. Can it work? It depends. It can work as far as, for example, on climate. It's perfectly possible that the EU, together with China, together with emerging countries, finds a way to move forward on climate. And the US represents 11% of global emissions, so it's not a big player in this regard. Now, on some other fields, the US will be hard to dispense of. Because the difficulty is that the willingness to enter into commitments, the willingness to provide, for example, swap lines to third countries, that's something the US has done. And that's not something the EU has done. And I think the question is, and that's not something that China has really done, because China has provided swap lines in renminbi, but the renminbi is not a fully fledged international currency. So I think we're in an unstable environment, but we have to learn how to live with that. And I think that's the challenge going forward.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that? What do you see happen with this initiative from the BRICS countries on international payment systems, alternatives to the dollar, and so on? And how do you see Europe or the Eurozone most effectively playing a constructive role for itself? What's the smartest way for the Eurozone to adapt to this?
I don't think it's a very serious initiative at this stage. I think it's a political signal, but it's not a strong financial system. I mean, there is no substitute to the US as a financial superpower, and Europe certainly is not ready and has not taken the decisions that would help make it a financial superpower. So I think at this stage, we most likely remain in a system in which there's a financial superpower, the manufacturing superpower, which is China. There are other players who play a significant role in the field of emission, like the big emerging countries, and this sort of non-system. The question is how to make it work, and that's the challenge going forward.
Just while we're on global monetary issues, I do want to ask about my hobby horse, which is this debate about whether to confiscate the Russian central bank reserves that are blocked. So obviously that one of the arguments against is that it jeopardizes whatever hope the euro has to become a bigger international currency. But it would also obviously help with both Ukraine doing better in the war and relieve some of these pressures on budgets for whoever has to pay for it. So I'd like to hear all of you. Just what is your take on that debate? Maybe Jean, do you want to start?
I think the decision that was taken or that is being taken has deep consequences.
The original blocking.
The original blocking.
Yeah.
Essentially because the US dollar was perceived as a sort of a global currency, and the indication that these reserves have been immobilized is a strong indication that the West is ready to weaponize its global financial role. So the consequence is that not in the short term, because in the short term there are no major alternatives, but in the medium run there will be increasingly attempts to create an alternative to the Western dominated financial system. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm not sure this was all the consequences of these decisions have been weighted properly before taking the decision.
But for you, the original decision to immobilize was already a big decision, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Arancha.
No, first, the internationalization of the euro had trouble well before this, and the trouble is well known, and is in the order of politics more than the decision that was taken concerning the assets of Russia. Second, the solidity of the dollar is much bigger than we think, because the alternative, to create an alternative, not an alternative payment system, which is what the BRICS are creating, to create an alternative currency, you need to have a big trader to anchor it. And the only big trader that we have that could anchor it is China. But given the state of the Chinese RMB, I don't think this is going to happen soon. Now, I think what we need to look at is at what happens with crypto assets and cryptocurrencies, which is the area where the BRICS are building on taking this conversation. For now, what they've done is they've done a payment system, basically saying in the trade between us, we may not necessarily want to use dollars, right? We clear this is some form of barter trade done in a very gloriously written manner. But there is another part of the BRICS proposal that has to do with crypto assets, and that's given the interest that the new Trump administration has in this sphere, also that's another field to explore.
Do you have a view on the confiscation question?
No, I mean, look, we all know the fors and the against, and having a view on something that has been done, yes, it sends a signal, and it sent a signal that has triggered a set of movements on other countries, including China, but not only, including in the Gulf. A number of countries that have realized that now this asset is not as safe as it could be. That's, in my view, water under the bridge now.
But confiscating outright?
That's it's going to be a discussion. I don't think anyone will have in their top of their mind the solidity of the dollar or the internationalization of the euro. They're going to be looking at their fiscal position. Can I pay with somebody else's assets, and can I justify and paint this in a manner that looks, kind of reasonable to do? We've got all the literature on the table.
Yuriy?
I think it's a no-brainer in the sense that we see this huge fiscal cost imposed on Europe, on the US. American and European taxpayers are basically paying for the war, but not the Russians. It makes every sense to me to confiscate the assets and give it to Ukraine and minimize these debates about where exactly money is going to come. People say this is going to undermine the dollar and the euro as global currencies. I think this is an extremely unlikely event. Think about the alternatives. Arancha mentioned this already. My colleague Barry Eichengreen introduced me to the principle called TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative, right? Where would you go? Would you trust your money to, a communist regime, CCP? It's going to be a safe asset if your currency and savings are going to be parked there. I think it's very obvious it's not going to happen. And we know already that historically this situation was encountered by other countries. We used to have the ruble zone, right? So the Soviet Union had its own currency, forced Comecon countries to use this currency. As soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, everybody switched to dollars and Deutsche Marks. And I would say this, when you look at, what was happening with the value of euro and the role of euro in the international transactions, I think one thing which is really damaging in my view, the standing of the euro as a global currency, is the inability of the Soviet Union, European Union, to take a decisive action. Think about the global financial crisis. The problem originated in the US. That should have undermined the role of the dollar as the global currency, because these guys were bleeding big time. And yet, in the end, it was the problem in Europe, right? The global financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, and this really undermined the euro. It took a really long time to figure out a solution to this, and then people understood that, maybe if there is Mario Draghi who is going to say, I'm going to save the euro, whatever it takes, we discussed this, many times before, that was the decisive action. A signal that something is going to happen. There is somebody who is going to take responsibility and deliver. And this stuff does not happen very often in Europe, unfortunately. This is what is undermining, in my view, the role of the euro as a global currency.
I can't resist to mention the story by my colleagues in the FT this morning or a couple of days ago about all the money that Assad had spirited out of Syria to Moscow in advance of the inevitable end to his regime. And it was all in $100 and €500 bills. So even in the Syria-Assad-Moscow relationship, those are the currencies of choice. Are there any more questions? Okay, I see 3. Okay, make them very snappy, please. All the way in the back, then you and David.
University of Bern, Switzerland. I have a question about sanctions. Yuriy, you said sanctions were already quite tough. I think that's true on paper, but at least when I look at the statistics on enforcement of sanctions, I see exports of Germany to Kyrgyzstan going up by thousands of %, and there's still apparently a shadow fleet of new or Greek-operated tanks. So is it really true that not more can be done? And why apparently is the UK and the US doing more than the European Union now?
Good question. Here, please.
Antoine Bozio, Paris School of Economics. So my question is economists were very clear that sanctions would work and would have big effects. Then there was big disappointment about the effect of sanctions. And now it seems that there might be actually long-term effects, and I wanted to hear the panel on the views of how effective are economic sanctions.
Thanks very much. David Wines.
Can I go back to Arancha's question? She talked about how Ukraine has been in the interest of many other places, but the one place she didn't actually mention was in the interest of China. And I see the war in Ukraine as being extremely useful to
Correct.
Xi Jinping.
Correct.
You can take an aggressive view of Xi Jinping that we're all in the warm-up to Taiwan, or you can take a much less aggressive view that all he wants to do is deconstruct the world order and end up with a world which is no longer a US-managed world order, even in name. And the war in Ukraine, particularly a war that's neither resolved nor won or lost, but just drags on, producing debates like this for years, is an extraordinarily useful thing to Xi Jinping. And I think we need to understand that in thinking about the implications of that war.
Thanks, David. And I want to add something to that question, because ever since the spillover question came up, I wanted to ask you, it seems to me that to be a geopolitical actor, you need to be able to do linkages, right? So China is important. Europe needs to come to some sort of understanding on climate policy. Europe also doesn't like China's interest in Russia's adventures in Ukraine. Geopolitical decision-making presumably involves some sort of linking these different dossiers together. And my sense, at least, is that Europe is particularly bad at it if it is one of the emerging centers of this multipolar world. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and of course on whether we should look at sanctions policy as has it been a success or a failure? Is it evidence of ability or inability to do geopolitical action? Who wants to start? Arancha, you were name called, so do you want to start?
So, yeah, I agree that China is another one of the side effects of war in Ukraine. And right now, what Ukraine is doing is buying China much more time to deal with its own difficulties, right? It can buy energy at hugely discounted prices while it hastens its own decarbonation of its economy, which is doing very quickly, but still not fast enough. So that it allows it to, it gives it a much better way to do the energy transition than before the war. It allows it to reorganize, absorb the huge bubble that just bursted in the housing sector in a much more stable way, because, you know, as they say here in France, quand je me regarde, je me désole, quand je me compare, je me console, you know? So it's buying China, I don't think right now it's so much about redoing the order, but it's buying China a lot of time and a lot of space to manage its own difficulties and to manage its own transition, something that we have much more difficulty to do if I just take the climate transition, that it's much harder for us because they can play much more with combining fossil fuels with decarbonation. Europe does linkages, but it does it in a much more clunky way, like everything Europe does. A lot of the linkages are not necessarily done at the European level, they are done at the level of the member states. So it's the combination of these two dimensions that, in my view, we need to consider for the linkages. But of course, if you are not one, but a collection of 27, it's much more difficult to operate in a geopolitical environment to project power. And in a geopolitical environment, you need to be able to project power. It's much more difficult to project power, but it also conversely gives you much more flexibility to absorb trouble. So in the end, it's the result of these two. You may end up being underestimated, but you may end up managing this geopolitical trouble in a much more flexible manner.
Sure.
Yeah, on sanctions, I agree with what has been said. I think that the very principle of sanctions was very sensible, but the implementation of sanctions has been awful. It is strange. I mean, looking from the outside, that the behavior of Europe and European countries and the private sector has been such that the effectiveness of sanctions have been greatly diminished by this type of behavior. Now, there is still the longer-term sanction, the prevention or the prohibition of export of critical equipment and to Russia that has had some effectiveness, but the circumventing of sanctions, of financial sanction especially, has been awful. So I think we should draw lessons from that. I mean, this is not something that ought to be repeated.
Yuriy.
I agree with John. You know, the idea is sound, implementation is terrible. You know, think about this. The European Union agreed to get rid of Russian oil in the summer of 2022, but they gave everybody time until December 2022 to make all the necessary adjustments. But, you know, these adjustments are not only made by the European companies, they're also made by the Russians. Right? So you give them time to adjust to this new reality. Now, I'm not a military strategist, so you should take my advice with a grain of salt. But, you know, the basic principle there is that you have to have shock and awe, right? You have to front load everything. You have the toughest sanctions immediately. This is the way to achieve the maximum effect. This has not been done. You know, the sanctions are very, very reactive in nature. You know, something terrible is done by Russians in Ukraine, and then we have a new round of sanctions. Then they do another terrible thing in Ukraine, there is a new round of sanctions. This is very, very reactive. If you really want to win the war, you have to be proactive. You have to dictate, you know, what is happening. And this is something that has not been done. You know, people often ask me, can we do more with sanctions? My response is there is no limit to perfection. You can keep doing more and more and more, and obviously there is a lot of scope to do this. The obvious one is enforcement. You know, we have this piecemeal introduction of sanctions, which already is not very helpful, and then you fail to enforce. Obviously, this is not going to be as effective as it should. Somebody has to get serious about this. And unfortunately, in the US, they are not serious about this, because you look at the size of the staff that is enforcing sanctions, it's like 10 people. It shouldn't be like that. It should be like 1,000 to make sure that, you know, German components don't go to Kyrgyzstan and end up in Russian missiles that attack Ukrainian cities. It's ridiculous. It should not be there. And finally, you know, a lot of discussion here is about what we can do, but it's very obvious in terms of sanctions what we have to do. You know, the oil and gas revenue, this is the lifeline of the Russian war machine. You take it out, they're going to literally run out of money very, very quickly. And you don't have to go very far to see how this can happen. Look at the Soviet Union. In 1986, oil prices collapsed, Soviet Union ran out of money, and they had to reform themselves. Gorbachev was not exactly a Democrat. You know, he wanted to change the system because he realized that they don't have enough resources. You read memoirs of all the Soviet leaders from that era, and they say, we're desperate for money. Oil revenue was our lifeline. When that ended, we had to change something because we know we couldn't continue as before. And so something like this has to be done with Russian oil now. But then we have lots of leakages. You know, oil is flowing to China, oil is flowing to India. And going back to my opening remarks when I said Trump does not control every, you know, geopolitical player, who will prevent India from buying Russian oil? I don't think anybody. China? Probably not. But it doesn't mean we have no ability to tighten the screw on the Russian economy. We certainly can, and they're in a very difficult position now. You know, yesterday we had Isabel Schnabel, and we talked about normalization and interest rates, you know, 3-4%. You go to the Russian central bank, and their interest rates are at 20%, and probably they're going to increase. This is not a good position for the economy to absorb any kind of shock. And so maybe it's not going to be one big blow that is going to finish, the Russian economy. Maybe it will be a death by 1,000 cuts, but you have to keep doing this over and over.
And what Yuriy's last point illustrates is, of course, we didn't have time to talk much about it, but the energy and carbon transition is something of deep geopolitical consequence. We're out of time, so we have to end, but thank you very much, and join me in thanking the panelists.